Before I can configure security in my analysis services database, I need to have deployed and processed my database because, as you'll see, when we go to configure the roles, we'll be interacting with metadata, and that metadata needs to be on the server first. Now, the process for configuring security roles, whether I'm in BIDS or in Management Studio, is identical. The difference is, if I create roles within BIDS, then the definition of the roles is part of the project and can be deployed as part of a script. Sometimes, though, the security administration is managed by a completely different group, and therefore we have the choice of isolating the security management away from the development process. But for simplicity of testing, we're going to work within the BIDS environment. I'm going to right-click on the Roles folder and create a new role. And then I can give this role a name. And for this role, I'm going to create a role for my European users. So we'll call this Europe. And we'll retain the role file extension. So here's the designer for our security role. On the first page, we can see the role name, and we can type in a description so that we can document what this role is intended to do. Now, there are database permissions for this role, and these database permissions are really intended for assigning administrative privileges to users. We can give users in this role full control of the database, meaning they can create security roles and process the database, or we can simply give users in this role permission to process the database, or we can give them permissions to read the definition of the database. Well, for our regular users who only need access to the cube, none of these permissions are necessary, so we'll leave these blank. Then on the Membership tab, we would provide the users or groups for this role. So we just click Add, and then we can get information from our Active Directory or local security groups, either at the user level or the Windows group level for assignment to this role. It's considered best practice to only work with Windows groups here. I have a group set up called SSAS Basic Users. And we'll assign those users to this role. Then we have a Data Sources tab, and this just gives permissions to read the definition of the data source, which is not something we would normally allow users to do from their client applications. Typically, the ability to read the data source would be something that would be done within Management Studio, which would not be a tool used regularly by our users. So we don't need to give users access to the data source. The possible options here are None and Read. Then moving to the Cubes tab, we see our single cube from our database, and we can see that the default security is None. We need to change this. So by default, our database is completely secure and no users can access the cube. So at minimum, each of our roles will need to have read access to the cube. If we're using a special feature called Write Back, we would enable read-write permissions for those users who would be writing data back to our cube. Now, some front-end tools will allow the users to create local cubes or to perform drill-through functions. By default, this feature is disabled, but we can enable drill-through by itself or both drill-through and local cube creation capabilities. And if we want to give users permission to process a single cube within a database, we can do so here. Although again, this would be primarily for administrative users and not for our business users who are using the cube for reporting and analysis. So at this point, we're completely done. This would be the minimum security that we would need to configure for our cube. But if we want to take this a little bit further and control within the cube what our users can see, then we're going to need to configure our dimension security. Now we see a tab here for dimensions, and all this does is determine which dimensions the users have read access to or read-write access to if we've enabled write back for dimensions. Write back would be used in budgeting and forecasting scenarios, so we would have typically a scenario dimension where the users would create separate forecasts or separate scenarios and add members to a dimension. But that's a very special case scenario. Most of the time we just need the users to have read access here, And then to control which data within a dimension that users can see, we need to go to the Dimension Data tab. Here at the top, we have a drop-down list that shows us each of the dimensions at the database level, and then you'll see the dimensions repeated within the cube. So if there are multiple cubes within the same dimension, we can configure different rules for security on a cube-by-cube basis. But typically, we would control security at the database level, and then that security is inherited by each of the cube dimensions. So we've created a role for Europe, so we'll go to Territory to configure security there. And here we see all of the members for the country attribute. And if we use this drop-down list, we can see the other attributes available. So by default, our users can see all of the members within a given attribute hierarchy. Now we've named this role Europe, so you can probably guess that I'm going to clear the selection of all members and then specify only the Europe member. And now we can see for the group the attribute security is defined, and that's how we can tell in a list of attributes where we've applied security and where we haven't, which is helpful when we have a long list of attributes. We can also see at the dimension level where we have attribute security defined. Now what's happened under the covers here, we can see on the advanced page. We have an allowed member set. So here's a set, it's designated by braces, and it contains one or more members from the same dimension and attribute hierarchy. So here we have Territory Group Europe. Remember from our module on calculations that when we see the ampersand reference, that the value we see following that will be the key column value rather than the name column value. In the case of Europe, with or without the ampersand gives us the same result because the key column and the name column are identical. Now this is just a simple list of members in our allowed member set, but we can get more complex using set operations. Here's a button here to edit the MDX. And so if we have specific rules that we want to apply, we can use set functions to come up with an expression that will resolve as a set of members of our group attribute and thereby control access to the members within this hierarchy.